All right, so as most of the world continues focusing on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine for pretty obvious and justified reasons, there are still many other crises that are going on around the world that I think deserve a good bit of attention and focus right now, especially as we consider like the dichotomy between how the media and our politicians talk about what's happening in Ukraine right now versus stuff that's been happening in, say, Afghanistan or Palestine, which are the two examples that we're going to get to here in videos that I got of basically two different representatives, one from Ireland and one from the European Parliament, who are basically just asking fair questions about why do we talk about the crisis in Ukraine so differently than we talk about what is happening to the Palestinian people, and so differently than what is currently being done to the Afghan people with Joe Biden deciding to essentially seize their central bank assets. So let's just go ahead and jump into this first clip here of Richard Boyd Barrett, who is asking questions about why people are not willing to use the strong language and criticisms and policies that we have deployed against Vladimir Putin and apply those same exact moral standards to a country like Israel that is conducting an ongoing ethnic cleansing and apartheid to the Palestinian people. So let's just go ahead and watch this clip.
The Arab population as a whole, the Palestinian population as a whole, as an inferior race. I mean, it doesn't get stronger than this. And yet you want to be careful about your language. You're happy to correctly use the most strong and robust language to describe the crimes against humanity of Vladimir Putin, but you will not use the same strength of language when it comes to describing Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, when it is now being documented and detailed by two of the most respected human rights organisations in the world, and indeed has been alleged by dozens and dozens of non-governmental organisations, and to be honest, anybody who looks honestly at the decades of brutal, inhumane persecution of the Palestinians, successive assaults on Gaza, the annexation of their land and territory, the systematic application of apartheid rules, you don't want to even use the word apartheid. Never mind sanctions. 5 days sanctions against Putin and his thugs, 70 years of oppression by the Palestinians, and it wouldn't be, what was the word you used? It wouldn't be helpful to impose sanctions. Amnesty International are calling for Israel to be referred to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Will you support it? They are calling for targeted sanctions against Israeli officials who are perpetuating the system of apartheid, just exactly the same types of sanctions you've just initiated against Vladimir Putin. Will you support it? And I think the answer is clearly you're not going to. And then we ask the question, why? Why? With such strength of feeling, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and Green TD stood up one after the other, saying it was intolerable, the thuggery and the warmongering and the brutality of Putin. You wouldn't stand for it. Urgent action had to be taken. But we've got to be much more careful with the Palestinians.
Right, so I think you guys get the main points that he was trying to get across there. Now, first of all, I don't really know much about domestic Irish politics or anything like that, but you can see the overlap if you live in the United States or if you live in any other major Western countries around the world. When it comes to talking about, countries that we have historically had conflict with, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or now Russia in this case with them invading Ukraine, the way that we talk about these different conflicts is somehow completely different with how we talk about what is happening in Israel and Palestinian territories. So he pretty much just laid it out there. I mean, we have brazen war crimes that have been committed for decades now, an ongoing apartheid and ethnic cleansing, the expansion of illegal settlements across Palestinian territories, etc. So these are all crimes that are arguably even worse than what Vladimir Putin is doing right now in Ukraine. And the point of saying that isn't to downplay what Putin is doing or to deflect from what he is doing right now. It's just to point out a brazen hypocrisy among amongst a lot of these Western countries, especially I know here in the United States, we have laws on the book in my home state here in Georgia that thankfully have been fought by people like Abby Martin and other Palestinian advocates, but we have actual enshrined into law laws that say if you are going to go, for example, as Abby Martin tried to do, go speak at a public university, you have to basically sign a loyalty pledge to Israel that says you won't support BDS, you won't support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is completely unconstitutional and absurd, but again, ties into the main point of what he's trying to say there, which is if we're going to have, this moral posturing with all of our politicians and media figures, if we're going to have a moral standard that we are holding leaders of the world to, then make it even across the board. I mean, I literally just saw Hillary Clinton just a couple hours ago actually tweet out, she had the audacity to come and tweet out that if Putin doesn't want to be considered a war criminal, he should stop bombing hospitals. Well, yeah, that's true. Vladimir Putin is absolutely a horrific, violent war criminal, and he's demonstrating that right now. But you are Hillary fucking Clinton, okay? If there's anybody on the face of the planet outside of maybe George W. Bush and a handful of others that should not be commenting on war crimes, it would be you. If we were going to apply this equal standard to war criminals and to crimes against humanity, Hillary Clinton, Obama, Bush, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, all of these motherfuckers would be in prison right now. So that's the main point of all of this, right? If you're going to have these critiques, if you're going to have these fair and valid critiques, then don't undercut them by refusing to have a actual standard that you are going to apply equally across the board. So I think that's the main point of what he was trying to say there, and I 100% agree with him and credit to him for giving a speech like this. I wish we could see this in the US Congress. Unfortunately, that's almost never the case outside of maybe a handful of times that I've seen. Now, another point that needs to be made about sanctions on this that I don't think a lot of people are understanding, the reasons why I am in favor of boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel, but not necessarily in favor of the broad sanctions that we have levied against Russia, is because there is a distinction between levying sanctions against an adversarial country versus levying sanctions against one of our top allies, okay? We have significantly more leverage over Israel because of the billions of dollars in aid that we give them, because of the military equipment, the intelligence support, etc., the diplomatic support that we give Israel. We have significantly more leverage over them than we do over a country like Russia that can just turn around and go, form tighter economic relations with China or Saudi Arabia, as we're seeing being demonstrated right now. So there is a difference in the potential efficacy of deploying sanctions against different countries. And as he was pointing out there, if you're going to do sanctions, do them in a targeted way, right? I would not be in favor of broad sanctions that hurt, innocent civilians in Israel or in like Israel proper, for example. I would not be necessarily in favor of those broad of sanctions, but target the officials, target the people who are actually in reinforcing this system of apartheid that Israel does. So in that same way, I would be in favor of the sanctions that go after Putin and the sanctions that go after the oligarchs, etc. So if you want to have actual principles in this, if you are an actual anti-imperialist, if you are actually against war crimes in a substantive way, then apply it across the board. And I guess that's the main point of what he is trying to say there, and what I'm also trying to say is, like, it's not just about trying to like deflect from Putin. That's not the point at all in any way, shape, or form. Again, this is an ongoing crime that is being committed against the Palestinian people in the same way that it's an ongoing crime being committed against the Ukrainian people, right? This is not something that happened in the distant history or anything like that. This is happening right the fuck now. So it's also important to keep acknowledging things like this that are ongoing. And on top of that, again, it's not to distract from Putin. It's to say, if we're going to hold Putin accountable, then you have to actually not be brazenly hypocritical about all of this, or else your word and your criticisms, like the one coming from Hillary Clinton about Vladimir Putin being a war criminal, your criticisms hold absolutely no weight, because anybody who is siding with Putin in this conversation can just turn around and say, well, you're Hillary fucking Clinton and you are also a war criminal. So, that's the main point that I want to get you guys to understand. Now, we have a second clip here from Claire Daly, a member of the European Parliament, who is making essentially a similar point, but about Afghanistan right now, who, again, the United States is essentially starving millions of innocent Afghan civilians to basically make Joe Biden look tough against the Taliban or whatever the fuck. So let's go ahead and listen to what she had to say.
There's no doubt about it. We're living in times of catastrophic crisis where the lives of innocent civilians are sacrificed in the wars of their masters. Yes, in Ukraine, but not only. Since the last plenary, tens of thousands of Afghani citizens have been forced to flee in search of food and safety. 5 million children face famine, an agonising and painful death, a 500% increase in child marriages and children being sold just so they can survive, and not a mention of it. Not here, not anywhere. No wall-to-wall TV coverage, no emergency humanitarian response, no special plenaries, not even a mention in this plenary, no Afghani delegations and no statements. My God, they must be wondering what makes their humanitarian crisis so unimportant.
So, I mean, yeah, she makes the point there, is it the color of their skin? And yeah, that's probably a significant portion of this. I also think there are slight differences, right? You're dealing with Russia, which is a nuclear armed superpower, and so them having, you know, the ability, or them invading another European country that could potentially come into conflict with NATO, that is slightly a different conversation, but nonetheless, the severity of these issues is put on full display. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of innocent Afghan civilians that are at risk of dying in the immediate future because of actions that are being taken by the Joe Biden administration and by other Western wealthy imperialist nations. So if we're talking about the severity of this, if we're talking about the human cost of this, these are things you should be talking about right the fuck now, okay? Because again, it's not some ancient history that we're trying to dig up to do a whataboutism. No, this is happening right now. This also needs to be addressed right the fuck now, or else millions of people are going to starve to death. And I think, you know, that on top of the Palestinian example from the Irish representative earlier, the time scale of all of this especially puts it on display, right? Because we've had 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, or even more if you want to talk about how we funded and armed the Mujahideen, etc. But, you know, decades and decades of conflict in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, etc. And also for the Palestinian people, decades and decades of subjugation and apartheid and ethnic cleansing and war crimes, etc. Decades and decades of all of this. And never was there ever a conversation about actually sanctioning or doing what we have done to Vladimir Putin to the state of Israel. Never was there a conversation after the Iraq invasion that, just as a reminder, killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, okay, within the first 5 years of the war, okay? Never was there a conversation from the international community about, we have to sanction the American people. We have to completely implode the American economy in order to prevent this crime from happening. So it's just about being consistent, right? If you are going to be a principled anti-imperialist, then you should oppose what Vladimir Putin is doing, and you should also oppose the imperialist actions that the United States is responsible for right now. Again, key point, right now.